Hi everybody, this is Foxwoods Fiend with DeucesCraft.com, and this is the first episode of Headhunter, my Heads Up series where I'll be playing 4 different opponents for 2 episodes worth of content. Head from Heads Up, and Hunter from me hunting all of my opponents trying to take down their money. Wilt, I thought, would be a pretty tough opponent because we've talked so much poker, and I've sweated him on multiple occasions back in the day, and I feel like he has a very good idea of how I play, and I wasn't quite as confident that I had a solid read on him. I assumed he would be really tough, and as he shows in this episode and the next one, that ended up being the case. So far, there's nothing much really interesting to talk about, other than my standard opening raise size Heads Up is 3x with any 2 cards. Once I start seeing that my opponent's playing more than 38% in the 40s from the big blind, I start min raising or folding some small blinds. But until that happens, I basically make them show me that I shouldn't be 3xing. Now, Ace Queen, any competent Heads Up opponent these days is going to be 5-bet jamming this hand. The only people you wouldn't do this against are like the biggest nits in the world. But if you have like any semblance of fold equity whatsoever, and you know that your opponent could be doing this with like mid pairs that you're like coin flipping against and already have dead money in the pot that you need to get your equity from, there's not really anything interesting to talk about that. King Queen, a lot of people, sometimes I coach people who start off just calling King Queen because they don't think that their opponent is going to call them with too many dominated hands. I don't agree with that. I think that King Queen does very well against even a dynamic free calling range against a 3-bet, and I think that more importantly, eventually it should get to the point where you're 3-betting enough that King Queen, which makes such good top pairs, is just like an absolute nut hand. In this case, I just assumed that Wilt would think that I'm at the level where he can defend 3-bets pretty wide with like good Broadway cards, and King Queen would be smashing a lot of his range. This hand on the left that comes up I want to talk about because, first of all, I think that it's important to talk about what kinds of hands you c-bet. And I like to c-bet whenever I have like likely the best hand, but it's also very, very vulnerable. So I think that 7-Jack here is like a mandatory c-bet because basically like half the board can peel off and make it impossible for me to bet the turn to protect my hand. So if I check the turn, or the flop, I'm probably checking the turn, and eventually I've given my opponent, who almost always has at least one and most likely 2 overs, 2 free cards. On top of that, I think that just getting like him to fold all of his like Ace X hand, or sorry, King X hands is also valuable, but so is getting him to call with Ace X, because if he has like Ace 9, even like Ace 5 or Ace 6, he'll probably call with them. So it's a pretty easy bet, but then I get check raise, and I don't really know what to do against Wilt. But he's giving me, better than 3-1 on a call, and I've got position, and I think that it's a fairly easy call. You can't just c-bet and then fold like basically everything but a good 8. The turn card comes, and it's really a bad turn card for me once he bets. And the reason is not only did like 4-5 get there, which I don't think he really has too often, because I don't expect him to be flatting 4-5 suited against me, but not only did like 9-10 get there, so did hands like 5-6 suited, 6-9 suited, and not only should that make him think that I'm less likely to fold, because if I had a straight draw, now I have a pair plus straight draw, which pretty much like is never folding, but also should make him less likely to bet, because with a lot of his like flop bluff range, he's now paired up and is probably going to try exercising some pot control or get to showdown, hoping that he's good against whatever I may have, like Ace 3, 3-4, something like that, while not wanting to bloat the pot just in case he's got the worst hand. So that's 6 of spades, basically just mandatory fold for me against somebody that is giving me like the first check raise of the match. And honestly, I would probably fold this against everyone unless I had a read that they just like basically check raise bear overs, and then anytime draws get there, they like barrel off. 5-8 suited, pretty easy 3-bet. Queen 4 suited, a bit more marginal, but at this point, he hadn't really done anything that tough. He was opening like 90 to 95% of buttons, and other than 4-betting 8s, he hadn't really done much to like make me think that I couldn't just run him over with 3-bets, or at least like very aggressively 3-bet him. Now that ends up being not true later on in the match, and we'll see how that dynamic develops. But at the time, my assumption was that I could just 3-bet him fairly aggressively. This ace-king min-raise, I just wanted to note that at this point Wilt was defending around 38% of big blinds, which I'm fine with because I don't show an immediate profit on my opens, but now I'm basically like breaking even on them and have the ability to just play post-flop. So basically, even though I'm not showing an automatic profit by 3xing with like 3-8, the chance of, or like 4-5 offsuit, the chance of hitting a pair makes it good enough because I have some equity against his hand. So I could still 3x. But ideally, I'd like to see, if I start min-raising, how does his VPIP from the big blind go up? If he starts only doing it, 42% or 43% and doesn't really massively expand his calling range, then now with the min-raise, which only needs to work 50% of the time, I am showing a profit, whereas with a 3x I wasn't. Now the problem with switching to min-raise is I found that a lot of times opponents will assume that if you're min-raising all of a sudden, it's because you're just trying to take down the blinds cheap, and they start 3xing or 4xing your min-raises with a very wide range. So one thing that I like to do is I like to have a fairly balanced switch to a min-raise range, where all of a sudden if I have a hand like ace-king and I'm thinking to myself, it would probably be good to mix in some min-raises. I mix it in with ace-king, hoping that I can induce a 3-bet. In this case, it didn't really work. Wilt is just too sly. These tricks don't work. Apparently, though, he's starting to really ratchet up the 3-bets. He's at 16% now, and I think that eventually he starts getting, he's at 22% after that one. So against somebody who 3-bets a lot, I like to min-raise. I think that it's a fairly easy adjustment to make that a lot of players don't make. If somebody's basically just making sure that a lot of the time there's only the 10 big blinds go in pre-flop, and that kind of negates your positional advantage, then you have to make sure that he can't just 3-bet you all the time. And a very good way to do that is min-raising. It induces more appeals and makes it easier for you to call and outplay your opponent post-flop with way deeper stacks relative to pot. This turn bet, pretty standard, protect my hand, extract value. And Aaron raises me just 2.8x. We'll talk about this hand more because I think that between this raise and the river action, it ends up being fairly interesting. I'd like to flag that with the 10-jack offsuit, I'm going to give him a check raise. And with hands like 10-jack on deuce 5-7, those are really good hands to check raise because, first of all, it's good that an 8 or a 9 can come down and you can semi-bluff a gut shot with a turn card that probably hits a lot of your check raising range, right? So if you hit an 8 and you bet, you've got a lot of outs, and your opponent's probably going to think a lot of the same things that I thought when that 6 paired on the 7-8-3-6 board, or the 6 came down, not paired. He's probably going to think, well, if he had 6-8, he's got a pair, so if he's betting it, my 5 and my 7 aren't good. If he had 4-6, that got there. His gut shots 6-9 got there, and they're probably going to fold. But I think that just in general, even if that backdoor gut shot weren't there, whenever you have 2 overcards on a really dry board of unders where your pair outs don't make any straights and they're not scare cards for you, it's really a good spot to check raise because you can get folds right there, and if you hit a top pair, you can barrel the turn and river and oftentimes get called down really light because it'll look like a busted straight draw when you're only representing a turn top pair or a flop monster. And a lot of times people will just call you down with 5-6 because they'll be wait, what's he have? The turn comes a jack and you bet turn, bet river. They're going to be well, 3-4, 4-6, 6-8, 6-9, and only some 10x and jack x combos, depending on which one comes down on the turn. So he folds, and I think it's fairly standard. Probably got him to fold king high or queen high, which is always good when you've got jack high, would be my guess. The ace-9, I really didn't know what to put Aaron on. I think that he's a good enough player to not bluff raise and then barrel through, knowing that he's not really repping much, right? Most flush draws would bet the flop. So unless he had a super slow played monster king x of diamonds that he was trying to induce some action from, figuring he's invulnerable, my guess is that he probably had ace-3 or ace-6. Those are hands that would make sense for him to check back the flop and then raise the turn. but it's really hard to put him on much with that raising when I donk into him on an ace high board, because I don't think he'd like just raise me and then bet with like ace 10 or ace jack, especially now with that kind of timing. It happened pretty quickly. So it's hard to put him on too many better hands, but at the same time, it's a really weird bluff spot because I think he expects me to just check call with most of like my king X with the diamond and like pair plus diamond. So he should really know when I'm donking and calling that I have an ace. I don't really expect him to try getting me off it. It's possible he had a hand like 10 queen with the queen of diamonds or 10 jack with the 10 of diamonds, some sort of gut shot plus one card flush draw. I wouldn't be surprised if he had it. But I think that once I call the turn and check the river, um, his bluff frequency should be fairly low. The pocket queens here, not a very standard bet for me. A lot of the times I just check because this is a board in which I'm not going 3 streets for value anyway. And I'll probably check like a lot of my ace X for balance because I'm not going 3 streets with like ace 4. In this case, because Aaron was playing fairly tight against my 3 bets, I guess he only folded 50%, but he hadn't really gotten out of line at all. I thought that I could probably just like take it down right there instead of like playing a guessing game OOP. And when you're only risking like 180 to win 400, that's very good pot odds on such a dry board to just like take down the hand and maybe, just maybe, extract some value from hands like king queen, king jack, jack queen, pocket eights, pocket nines, which he probably doesn't have because he'd 4-bet those pairs a good amount of the time. But extract some value from some of the gut shots, and at the same time, keep him off balance. Because I think that's very good to just like sometimes pound away on my opponent with these small bets that I know that even though I'm 3-betting a lot, I can exert a lot of pressure on him, and he knows that I'm going to be betting quite often and with a not particularly polarized range. With that said, looking back at this, I probably should have just check called the queens. Now he calls, and the turn comes a king, and basically everything got there. The jack queens, the king jacks, the king nines, all the king X peels that thought they were good and were getting good pot odds, they just got there. Once he bets, I actually think that he could be doing this with like an ace to protect against like what he thinks I might have, like a king jack type hand. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he just had trips or like a straight up. This ace 3 suited, I decided not to jam, and obviously like mid pairs like 6s and 7s are like the best hands to jam with if you think your opponent's like 4-bet bluffing. Well, obviously like aces is the best hand to jam with, and like kings and ace king. But if you think that your opponent's got like a very wide 4-betting range, the hands that do the best against the depolarized, not very tight value ranges, the hands like ace 10s, ace jacks, pocket 6s, pocket 7s, pocket 8s, the hands that do best against those parts of the range that you're concerned about getting snapped off by are like mid pairs like 8s and 9s, and 7s, stuff like that. Next up is the suited aces. So this is actually a very good spot to jam. My only concern is that there's not that much money to be won because there's only 540 in the pot as opposed to like a standard 4-bet pot in a 3x open, in which case there'd be more money to take down. And also, once he shows me he can like 4-bet those mid pairs, the 3 is such a dangling little low card there that really ruins my equity against his value range so badly that I just don't think I can jam this profitably. As opposed to if it were like ace 10 off or ace 7 suited, I would. I peel, which is honestly probably a bad peel. Yeah, I'm getting decent odds to try hitting an ace, I suppose, but I also think that on the vast majority of boards, I'm going to like, if he was bluffing, I'm going to incorrectly check fold, and the times that he's not bluffing, I'm going to be in a severe reverse implied odds situation where he can just pot control his better hand or worse hands and extract value with his better hands. So I think that was probably a jam or fold, and I did neither, so that was bad. 6s, a lot of people like to flat. I don't like flatting the small to mid pairs because I think that they play very poorly post-flop, and I think that they do very well against aggressive 4-betters. In terms of like I can jam with them and know that it's probably pretty profitable until my opponent starts, tightening up his 4-betting range. 6-7 suited, very standard min raise for me. I min raise with like my monsters and my, basically with a lot of hands that want to call a 3-bet, whether it's like ace 10 or 6 7 or pocket aces, pocket kings. I like to have a lot of balance with my min raising range, but I think that's very important to just be cognizant of the fact that a hand like 6 7 suited is an implied odds hand. And ideally, if you know your opponent's 3-betting a lot, and you know you kind of should be calling either way, ideally you would make it a min raise instead of a 3x, that there's more money in the stack so you can have more post flop playability with position, at the same time have greater implied odds by not having to put in as much money. With that said, once it comes 7-8 jack, if he's got ace king, king queen, ace king, um, anything like that, I can bet to take it down. If he's got the best hand, I've probably got 5 outs and I can just check back the turn. So it's not that bad putting in, $240 with most of the time, even if I'm behind, like, 20 to 25% equity. And, um, you know, basically I just bet to protect there, and I think it's very standard. I think it's also good to show that you can do that, so that your opponent can't just check call you with like ace highs or like king nines on those types of boards. No, because he thinks that you have a very polarized range. And I think just showing that you bet to protect and take it down in 3-bet pots also discourages your opponent from 3-betting you quite as much, because he knows that on those boards where he has to give up, he's not going to be getting the showdown cheap too often. The 6-8 on the right, I mess up my bet sizing a bit. 120 is a very cheap bet size, and you could argue that it's good because it induces calls from like ace highs, and when you have a hand that has equity and outs that you can barrel with, it's not that bad to induce like a check call with like pocket eights or ace 10, while you can still represent a lot of like king x's. And keep in mind, like, good king x's are a very big part of my calling a 3-bet range, because it doesn't make sense to 4-bet them, because you don't oftentimes 4-bet call and get it in good with king high, and you can't fold them. So I can very credibly represent a king. I think I should have bet like slightly bigger, because then to get stacks in on the river, less than a pot size bet, I have to bet like fairly big on such a dry board. So maybe I should have bet like 160 and set up like a smaller turn bet relative to pot to set up a jam on the river. But either way, you see what happens. It's a dry board. Your opponent's going to be check calling you a lot and then check folding a fair amount of the time. And a gut shot with, clean pair outs against ace highs is one of the better hands you can be barreling your opponent with. Especially keep in mind that since I had so little equity in the first place with 8 high, it's one of those spots where the worse your equity is, or the worse your showdown value is, whenever you have outs, the better it is to just barrel through the hand. Now, that doesn't mean like barrel every single time you have a gut shot. You have to be cognizant of like board textures in your opponent's range. But when he check calls and you've got like 8 high, but with 4 to 10 clean outs, and he checks again, you should probably just barrel that very, very often. This is my standard c-bet size on the left. On draw heavy boards, I pot it or pot minus a big blind. I don't really like barreling, even though I have like a decent amount of outs when that turn flush card comes, because I think that it's going to be really easy for Will to check call me with any jack or any queen, knowing that I could easily just have like a 1 diamond hand that's muscling through. Hit the straight on the river. Obviously, no reason to believe it's not the best hand. So, very, very standard value bet. Here with the 6-9, exactly the same concept I was talking about with the 7 jack. You just bet to protect these like really marginal made hands, where you can get called down by worse hands and also fold out, worse hands that have a lot of equity against you. Like even getting like queen 9 to fold is a really big deal here. So again, on 6-10-10, ace king is pretty much the nuts. Especially, I think that Wilt would probably 4-bet most pairs, so it's really hard for him to have the best hand unless he's got trips or a 6. So I think that if I jam, he just plays perfectly, and I can probably just induce a bluff from him on a later street by calling. It's going to look a lot like I have ace high, and I think he's possibly going to try getting me off it. But more importantly, like, I just don't see what the point is of jamming all in, because I don't think I get too much action from worse hands. So I'm just going to call. Honestly, on that 9, I would probably fold, because so many of his like random gut shots, either paired up or mate a straight. Now the river goes check check. I was going to check fold this river because I just can't see Wilt running a bluff here. I mean, what's he representing? It should seem fairly obvious I have something Vic can call. And as it turns out, he went for the solo. I said he plays pretty much perfectly, and that ace-8 raise I actually really like because he knows that I'm not just going to, spaz out and jam all in with ace-king or ace-queen on that kind of board. So that's just a spot where um, he really understood my um, style of play very well. He knows that I am not going to just 3-bet him with a hand that has showdown value and turn it into a bluff. So because of that, he knew that on that kind of board, if I do 3-bet him, it's probably not hands that dominate him. So he always has at least like the aces and out. And on top of that, it's an easy board for me to try rebluffing. So he tried raising there to induce against me and got unlucky that I didn't have a hand to bluff with. I had ace-king. But I actually thought that was a very smart play by Aaron. This ace-king is a very easy c-bet because on 3-4-9, I think I get called by pretty much every ace-high, unless he goes for the sick bluff inducer again. And because of that, I thought that they're just like straight up value, especially because I don't think he calls with too many like 3x or 4x type hands. So I thought he'd be floating me a decent amount of time. Here at this point, Aaron had been check raising so many flops that I thought that I just like had to, an open-ended straight draw on a board where he knows I'm going to be c-betting a lot, but at the same time, I don't think he's got a hand that can play for stacks too often. So I 3-bet him, and he calls, and at this point I'm kind of worried he might check back. This ace-king, I could definitely see Aaron like calling the flop and then checking back the turn as a bluff, but I think it looks so much like a value line that I kind of have to give him credit. I make a bad bluff here at the queen six. Sometimes I just can't help myself. I'm like, he check raised and then just called. How nutty could he really be? And if I bet something smallish, I can represent like 9-10 or pocket tens or something like that. In actuality, like I just would have jammed the turn with anything that can value bet the river, unless it's like a super thin value with like ace-8. And it turns out that when Aaron check raises 7-8-9 calls it 3-bet, he's not folding. That was a bad bluff, but A for effort. These ace-8 hands, I like to 3-bet. He's only folding the, like, 47% of 3-bets or something absurd like that. So he's calling a lot of 3-bets. And I was thinking about jamming this. His 4-bet range is 7.5%. It's not really wide enough for me to feel comfortable sticking it in. If it were like somewhere like 11 or 12%, I would. But when somebody's playing a ton of buttons, you should kind of assume that if with ace x you either have fold equity, or if you don't, you're not doing too badly against his range, assuming that he calls a lot instead of 4-betting. So I thought that ace-8 I could just straight up take him to value, because when you add like he has like 95% of hands in his opening range and then defends like 56% of the time. So that means that his like calling range is going to be like the top like 40 some percent of hands. And based on that, I just thought that like ace-8 I could extract value with. It's obviously like a hard hand to play pre-flop, but it's or post-flop. It's pre-flop equity against such a wide range. I think I kind of have to just extract. Ace deuce, I think it's a very, very, very easy check call. I've got the backdoor nut flush draw, so I don't care if a heart peels off. I've got some showdown value, but I'm not folding out too many better hands. And I don't think I'm getting like barreled too often on this board. It's possible he might see a check call as like being like ace-king or ace-10. If that's true, he's definitely not bluffing the turn. But I think he knows that I can have like ace-jack or queen-9 or something like that on that kind of board and check call it. So I'm not too worried about him thinking that my range is obviously very weak, because I'm definitely capable of like check calling with some hand that I'm just trying to like induce bets from. At this point, when he's at 16%, I've got like an ace blocker and haven't really been 4-betting him too much. I think it's a very easy 4-bet. And that's something I like to look at, right? It's like card removal is very important in deciding whether or not to 4-bet. So is how often you've been doing it, how wide your opponent's 3-betting range is, and how wide he thinks your 4-bet calling range is. And since he rightfully should think that I'm like 4-bet calling hands like ace-jack, ace 10 suited, pocket eights, pocket nines. He can't just jam thinking like I 4-bet bluff a lot, but I don't do it for value with too many hands. So I think that's like a very easy 4-bet bluff spot. I was tempted to call the ace 3 because I do think that Aaron would like barrel through with the king quite often and doesn't c-bet king high too much on those boards with like 3, 6, 8, where he should expect ace high to call fairly often. But at the same time, I think he's also smart enough to go for an extra street of value with like tens and a good 9. Um, and when I'm at the bottom of my range with like a 3, it's way different than if I had flopped like second or top pair. And I think I can just ditch that very bottom of my range or towards the very bottom of my range, even though it's a pretty good turn card for Aaron to muscle through. And this hand is the momentum shifter, folks, not the 8-10. The 8-10, I basically just bet twice because I thought that it's a very easy board for me to go for value on 3 streets with like any king or even like, tens, jacks, or queens. And I think that he's probably calling me down twice with ace high or even like queen high, but not 3 times. But then that river king, I think, really is a bad river card to bluff because it's just not that many value combinations and in my range, and he looks like he could have basically nothing. So I think that he's going to know with like ace high or even queen high that his hand looks pretty weak and he's at the top of his range pretty much for like, check calling twice. And I could have so few value combinations that I don't think I was getting a fold, so I just checked back. And he made like a decent call in the turn with the jack high, but I wonder what he would have done on the river. The 9-10, again, when you have equity and no showdown value, and your opponent c-bets a lot, just like with the 10-jack, with the 9-10, it's a good spot to bluff. I turn it open-ended, and honestly, I think that he could have an 8 to call down, but I wouldn't be surprised if he only calls the turn with like trips. I wasn't really planning on bluffing this river. I think it would just be such a suicidal bluff spot because his hand could very, very easily be like any trip queens, and there's a chance he just like folds an 8. So I think he's got like a very strong hand. I wasn't planning on bluffing. I got lucky and hit the jack and jammed all in. I think Aaron, he calls me with random trips, and his thinking is probably that once I check raise the flop, if I turned any sort of flush draw, then I would like muscle through with it, even like repping 9-10, and that if I had 10 jack, I wouldn't value jam it. So it looks like I've basically just got like full house or a straight, and I've got a lot of busted flush draws. So he calls me with the queen. I'm not a big fan of his call, honestly. I think he could probably maybe muck it, but then again, it's not like I've never tried like a crazy bluff to rep trips against trips before, The 9s, I figured that Aaron could A, be calling me with hands like 10 jack, ace 10, ace jack on this dry flop. I wanted to protect my hand. And I thought that on queen 6-8, after I 3-bet him, he would definitely peel any 6, any 8, and maybe even like, 7s or something like that. And I thought that his peeling range is wide enough, he could just be straight up floating me. And between those two factors, I just wanted to take it down. The pot was pretty big. I didn't think he would bluff me if I bet again. So I bet and he folded. If he had called, the plan would be to just check fold the river because I just don't see him double floating me and then bluff jamming, knowing that he's like not really representing that much, and knowing that I could actually bet twice and then check call him with a hand like queen 10 or something like that. And I have the nuts on every table. So a hand like ace 10, even though I'm like, slightly deep, like 125-ish, 130-ish big blinds, when you've got an opponent who only folds to 3-bets 37% of the time, ace 10 just goes through the roof in terms of value. So a lot of times you're inclined to think to yourself, well, ace 10 is a reverse implied odds hand. I don't think I win too many big pots with it, and I lose a lot of big pots with it. But when a guy's got a really, really wide range, I don't think that's true. So this is Aaron's first donk of the match. I want to talk about donking because I think that you could maybe argue for like a raise with 8-10. It is like a pretty strong draw with an overcard, but there's also something to be said for when there's so much money left to play for, just keeping the pot small. And if you hit this a straight, um, you can still probably like juice the pot because you're gonna get led into again. In this case, I decided to slow play it, but basically, I think that the risk of getting 3-bet by some draw that technically is a better hand than you, but you have better relative position against that draw, right? If he's got like 10 jack of hearts, I've got 8-10. Even though he's got like way the better hand, with position, I'm going to be able to outmaneuver him so much. Like I can like call him twice, and then when both of us brick, I can bluff him and rep like a thin value bet with like a 9 or a small 2 pair or something like that, and he's going to fold. So when there's so much playability because you guys are still really deep, and you get donked into, and if you raise with a weak draw, you might get 3-bet by tons of draws that you would eventually win the pot against if you had played some pot control. That's a really good spot to flat. In addition, I didn't think I have too much fold equity because he just hasn't been donking into me at all. So that kind of like raised the red flag that he had a hand that he was going to be able to 3-bet me with. I was going to raise him. Oh yeah, the reason why I didn't raise him is because he overbets. And I don't know what to put him on when he overbet. I think that he's very likely to have some sort of like flush draw, but if I call, it looks like maybe 7-8, 8-9, some sort of 2-pair, a hand that really just um can't raise but is good enough to call. And I thought about raising here, but honestly, when the river pairs and I called his turn overbet, I think that even if he's like value betting trips here, which he was, I just didn't think he would call me with worse because I can't really. I mean, listen, you have to have like a crazy image, and I have a crazy image, and I do not have anywhere near a crazy enough image to rep that I floated the turn, or to like float the turn with flush draw, and then just like jam when the board pairs, and expect my opponent to be like, huh, I guess he's bluffing, and call, right? I think that even with a very crazy image, if you call a $425 bet into a $200 pot and the river pairs and the guy still bets and you jam into him, it's like the bluff of the century, of a lifetime if you get away with it. Chances are he just had a busted flush draw. But um, basically his calling range is going to be, I feel like, just sets that filled up, or like 2 pairs that filled up that for some reason overbet, figuring I have like 8-9 or 7-8 or something like that. But I just can't imagine he calls a jam there, even with trip sixes, because it would just be too crazy of a bluff spot. With that said, I should maybe bluff there sometime. I think my hand, if I jam, would just look exactly like 6-7 or a slow played set, and there would be like no value to it. So Jack Queen, I actually think I should have 3-bet because the way he was playing with his only folding to 40% of 3-bets. Then again, part of the reason why he was only folding to 40% of 3-bets is that I'm 3-betting him roughly like 30% of hands. So maybe there's something to be said for toning it down a bit to rehabilitate my image, but it's kind of hard to figure out what adjustment to make, right? Once he knows you 3-bet so much, you can start 3-betting those really good Broadway cards, but you should probably stop 3-betting the like, low suited cards because those hinge a lot on having fold equity, which you just can't really, you know, have once you're 3-betting as wide as I am. That raise of his donk, he donked into me with a big draw, but I think that on King Queen 9, if there's any hand to raise other than like a monster, if there's any hand in your bluff range that you should be bluff raising, it's going to be like a gut shot with a second enough flush draw on a board where it's really hard for either one of us to have something. So this is my standard like half pot to slightly less than half pot bet size with my gut shot. I'm just trying to get him to fold his like 7-8s and 8-9s and stuff like that. Ace Jack should have 3-bet. for all the same reasons that I've been telling you guys that you can really start going to Value Town. But I think at this point I was just focusing on getting my 3-bet percent somewhat down so that I could maybe not get run over by 4 bets and floats. This is like a small little bluff with ace jack. I think that anytime you check call the flop and it goes check check on the turn, you're the person who can represent a value bet. And it's really hard for me to have nothing, right? Maybe ace 10 or some like out of position float with 9-10. But I think that if he paired up at some point in time in that hand, like on the turn or river, I have the worst hand, but he's folding like just about every time. So even though I had ace high, you have to think to yourself, if he's got a pair, what percentage of the time can he actually call me? In that case, I thought it was like low enough that I could definitely just bet here. Oh, this is funny with the nines. Aaron 3 bets, and I honestly I like to jam with nines 100 big blinds deep a lot because people think it looks like a small pair and call it off like fives or sixes or like 9-10 suited or something like that or just like a weak ace x. But in this case, I forgot that we're 150 big blinds deep, and I win. Spoiler alert. I win. So that was just like very lucky on my part. So I thought this is an interesting spot in my opinion. I thought about just donking out the ace deuce, but I thought, all right, it doesn't really look like I could be bluffing that often. And what do I expect him to call with? Maybe a king, and I'm willing to like give up the chance like he has a king and just checks back, and I lost like $260 of value or something like that by not betting. But I thought to myself, if he has like a weak ace, I could see him very easily like pot controlling the turn and then betting the river. Plus, there's always a chance he reps that by bluffing if he has like some sort of like busted straight draw or flush draw that he didn't barrel to take the free card with. So I thought he would bet this fairly often, and that I could value check raise him as well as like induce action from whatever might be in his bluff range. So, it looks like I could have like busted flush draw or just like turn like a king into a bluff like after check calling the flop because it really doesn't look like he has much. So he kind of, I mean, he was right. It looks like he doesn't have much, but I also wouldn't really try this check raise bluff too often and don't have much that check calls that flop that bluffs in the first place. So I think a snap call with ace 3 might be bad. But then again, if it's bad, it's only marginally bad. I donk the ace deuce to protect, and then when check check, that's obviously standard. You have to once it goes check check, and the board pairs. There's very few combinations of hands that are better than yours, but your hand is so vulnerable in that spot that you pretty much have to donk it out. Notice I'm like reverting back to some min raises. I just want to see like how he starts playing against the min raises because I've been somewhat uh, negligent in my min raise game and been like default 3xing a bit too often. Yeah, hands like ace 3 suited, you want to call 3-bet, but you want to keep the pot fairly small. And then for balance, you have to deal with like your monster hands like ace 10 suited. I guess I wasn't trying to, keep my 3-bet percent small after all. I must have just been like scared of 3-betting deep with ace jack when I didn't do it. But that's bad. I definitely should have just been extracting pre-flop value. This queen 9, oftentimes on boards like this where I don't oftentimes see bet like ace high or king high, I just go ahead and check back with like most of my pairs a good amount of the time such that my opponent can't just like automatically put me on like a whiffed uh, board entirely. Then I hit 2 pair, he leads, I don't see any point in raising him. I think it would probably just be way over representing my hand. So I call and he had 7-8. I think that the important reasoning there for my not raising the river is just that check 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 and then just like raise on that board would be making it seem like I have king jack or 7-8, and it's very hard for me to value raise him with just like mid 2 pair. But the reason why I checked that flop is because, as I was saying, a lot of times you give up on some boards. It's very important against anybody who's competent that you may be playing against that when you give up on some boards that you also have hands that can call turn and river bets. Because a lot of the time, a lot of players, what they do is they check back and then the turn comes some like random card and you get let into, and sometimes you have second pair and you peel, but more often than not, you can't really peel. And then even if you do peel, your hand just does not look at all strong, and you get let into on the river, and then you either have to start hero calling with your second pair that you pot control, or just like leaking money by calling the turn, folding the river. And I found the best way to avoid that is to just say, sometimes I'll check back top pair or like an over pair, and then my opponent will just be able to like donk into me with reckless abandon. Wilt's 3-bet, by the way, or 4-bet all in with deuces, I think is like pretty good. If you assume that I call it off with like ace 10 plus and like sevens plus or something like that, I've got to be 3-betting like 32%. And I'm close enough there that, at like 31 on the match or 30 on the match that, um, probably a fine jam by him. This deuce 9, he donked into me twice. I maybe could have raised the turn to protect, but I kind of wanted to see the river, and I wasn't entirely sure that I had the best hand in the first place. And then once like everything got there except for like ace 10, king 10, and queen 10, um, and queen jack, obviously, I just realized that it's very hard for him to be valuing worse, and very, very easy for him to be value betting. So I just ditched it. So 3-8 suited, I was considering 4-betting, but I just don't like 4-betting like total garbage. I think that these days it is the case that people peel 4-bets from time to time, in which case I want to have a hand that actually flops somewhat decent at least some percentage of the time, and 3-8 suited does not do that very often. And just from a game theory perspective, it's like you can't just float the pot with like total crap just because your opponent's 3-betting a fair amount. Because there's only so many times that your 4-bet bluff is going to work and that you can actually do it in the first place. So you might as well like save it for when you have some backup in case your opponent does peel. So even if in a vacuum that 4-bet would have been profitable, I think that it's kind of like a waste because I could have just 4-bet him at a later point in time with a hand that does better if he calls. The 8-9 offsuit, I just like to do this every once in a while on ace high boards because, obviously if you make it a standard, you're going to get barreled like crazy. But I just thought that Aaron would like c-bet this board and then give up on the turn a ton of the time unless he has some sort of, flush draw or, like real hand. Um, but, once he fires on the turn, there's really not much I can do other than like check raise to represent turn 2 pair, which when there's lots of flush draws out is not really something I recommend because people will just put you on one of them and go with it. So far, I would say that if I had to value in my play, I wasn't really doing a good job um, taking aggressive lines post flop in single race pots because Aaron was betting a lot, continuation betting roughly 60%, barreling quite often, and I wasn't really doing much to slow him down. So I think I should have mixed in more check raises or slow plays on the flop, pre-flop and on the flop. In terms of his 4-betting, I hadn't really 5-bet light on him much. I feel like he was starting to get the sense that he could just 4-bet me like pretty wide and get away with it, which pretty fair when I'm 3-betting like 27, 28%. But I probably should have jammed him a couple occasions so far that I wussed out on. And this ace 5 is definitely a donk, because I've got like a flush draw and I can represent a straight very easily and just barrel him on the turn and river if it comes a brick. But instead I just donked. Now this is funny with the threes because I was going to 5-bet jam them if he 4-bet, but he beat me to the punch, and I obviously can't call with a hand just like praying to God that maybe I'm coin flipping, getting such poor pot odds. So if he had deuces, it was a perfect 4-bet amount. This queen 5 suited, I felt like I was folding a lot of 3-bets, and I thought I could take it away from him. And this board, the 7-9-10 board, is a board that expects someone to maybe fire once, and then for me to be able to either like bluff him on the turn or check back and then bluff the river. So I think he expects me to raise him with a lot of my draws. And I think he doesn't expect me to really be folding this board like almost ever once I call the turn, because I should have like ace jacks, ace eights, 7-8, 8-9, 9-10. I could definitely slow play like two pair, trying to induce a turn bet from him so I can jam all in. So I thought that he wouldn't just like barrel me. And once he bet the turn, I realized that he must actually have a hand. So it's not something I do too often, right? To just like flow with total crap, no equity whatsoever. But when the board's so coordinated like that board was, that I don't expect to get bluffed too often at all, I think that it's like a spot where you can definitely go for like, a cool little float and then rep like half the board when it comes on the turn or river. I decided to donk out here just because I didn't think Aaron would be bluffing here very often, and I think that if I had some hand like 9-10 of clubs or a weak ace like ace deuce, I wouldn't mind like starting to turn it into a bluff in case he's got a better hand. So it didn't work, but it's kind of a cool thing to think about is donking out sometimes to balance out the times that you want to like turn the main hand into a bluff on an early street. Once we start getting deeper, I decided to 3-bet a bit bigger and, slightly more rarely just because you don't really want to give your opponent too much opportunity to just totally mess with you deep. And then I flopped top pair and I was planning on just stacking off with it regardless of what happened, but, I just took it down on the flop. Anyway, I'm going to call it a match for now because I want to save some of the footage from the rest of the match for the next video. Um, I think it would be really interesting to get some feedback from you guys of what you think of my play thus far so that we can evaluate how I make some adjustments throughout the rest of the match for the second episode. So if you guys are like, you should be 4-bet or 5-bet bluffing more often, we'll see if I end up doing that. If you guys think I should be like restricting my 3-betting range, we'll see if I do that. And just get some like discussion going of how Wilt's been playing, how I've been adjusting, and what I should do moving on. And then we'll just next week reveal, the part 2 of the match and see what kind of adjustments I made. For now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is episode 1 of Headhunters, and for Deuces Crack, this is Fox's Fame. Hope you guys enjoyed.